I know, it is kind of long. Like, you don't even how was it? I don't know. I haven't been. Very. That's a because that was a completely random. Whoever was there.
Here's our it was pretty big.
We have heard from the
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Lindsay Baker, the Executive Director of Maryland Humanities, and I'm thrilled to kick off the first public event for the 2022 One Maryland, One Book Author Tour. Some of you already hung out with us at the reception, so thank you for spending so much of your time today with us on this wonderful rainy fall afternoon. And to those of you joining us now, welcome. This event is one of more than 300 programs being held this fall as part of One Maryland, One Book, which we like to think of as Maryland's biggest book club. Since the beginning of One Maryland, One Book 15 years ago, the authors of our selected books have spoken at libraries, university campuses, and cultural centers across the state. We are proud to have this year's One Maryland, One Book author here with you, or with us, this afternoon. The level of enthusiasm we've seen for Naima Coster's What's Mine and Yours highlights our collective interest in racial equity, integration in schools, and change in socioeconomic communities. High school classes, book clubs, public libraries, senior centers, correctional facilities, and more have been participating in events inspired by the book across Maryland since September, and we hope you can plan to join us for more discussions and events this month. The topics presented in What's Mine and Yours are more relevant than ever: coming of age, identity, addiction, social class, racism, and discrimination. In this book, Ms. Coster shows the trajectory of two families over decades as they come and go from each other's lives over a school integration. At Maryland Humanities, we know that using literature as a jumping off point often makes difficult conversations just a little bit easier. Literature enables us to experience life as someone other than ourselves, and reading together allows us to share that experience and often, flex our empathy muscle. At Maryland Humanities, we're passionate about making empathy a part of everyday life. Programs like One Maryland, One Book, which if you ever hear Maryland Humanities staff, we call it OMOB, so you can be cool and call it that too, let's give an inside scoop. We use the humanities to explore our ideas, our stories, and our values to foster understanding among people with diverse perspectives and to strengthen our ability to interact meaningfully. I invite you to take a moment to learn more about our other programs. I was like, is that our website? Wow, it's not. By visiting mthumanities.org. And, if you enjoy your time with us this afternoon, I hope you will consider clicking on the donate button at the top of our website homepage. I'm pretty sure Reginald F has one of those buttons too, so you can click on both. We are an educational nonprofit, and it is people like you and your generosity that allows us to continue to offer nearly 1,000 free programs statewide annually. And I want to take this brief moment to thank our sponsors and partners who've made today's event possible. The Reginald F. Lewis Museum of that's why I call Reginald F. Lewis. Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture. Additional support is provided by the Maryland State Library Agency, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, Enoch Factory Library, Maryland State Department of Education, Baltimore City Public Schools, and Hollywood Books. The staff of the Reginald F. Lewis and its partners have put great effort in today's event, and we want to give a special thanks to Izetta, Morley, Rachel Graham, who I saw earlier but don't see now, Vinny White, who helped us out tremendously, and Terry Freeman. And with that, I'm going to toss it to Terry. Thank you.
much, Lindsay. We are just happy as can be to be able to host this event. As soon as I heard about it, I went to Isaiah. I was like, Isaiah, there's a One Maryland One book event. We gotta be a part of it. And she said, absolutely. So it was never a question of if. It was just a matter of how. Let me welcome you all into this place. I think that, places and spaces are very powerful, right? They have meaning. They actually are in many ways living. And what you bring to those spaces, there's a bug here. I'm sorry, you're gonna see me doing this. What you bring to it helps build whatever that place and space is. This particular place and space is where Black history and culture is not a sideshow, but the main event, okay? This isn't about, oh my goodness, we gotta add something about Black people to the equation. This is, let's make sure that we are fully representing our story. And in representing our story, we are expanding America's story. This museum opened in 2005 to be the authentic voice for African American history and culture. Today, we document, interpret, and preserve the complex experiences, contributions, and culture of Black people. We want to serve as a catalyst for sustained change, provide robust programs and exhibitions, and have bold conversations that educate and challenge. So I did not introduce myself, and I'm Terry Freeman, the Executive Director. And my thinking around what museums of history and culture have a responsibility to do is to make you think. If you come into a museum of history and culture and you don't leave thinking about something, we haven't done our job. And so my whole goal is to make you think. And maybe I'm going to agitate you a little bit. That's okay. Maybe I will be in some way conciliatory. Maybe I will present some type of really out there concept that has you kind of scratching your head, but makes you say, let me learn a little bit more about that. Then I have been successful in my role as executive director of this museum to make sure that you are leaving, frankly, with more than you came in with. So this afternoon, we have an incredible interview between Naima Coster, the incredible author of this incredible book, What's Mine and Yours, and our incredible director of interpretation, collections, and education. And I will say that because I hired her, and she's fabulous. So let me tell you a little bit about her, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about our author. Dr. Izetta Autumn Mobley, or I Am, as she refers to herself, is our Director of Interpretation, Collections, and Education. She's responsible for the presentation and interpretation of the story. So whatever the story is, she's the one who is responsible for the interpretation and the presentation of that, both visually and in the words that describe that story. She has considerable research experience in the following areas, and this is not all of them, folks. I was like, I can't keep it. I'm tired of writing, so I'm just gonna pull out a few of them. Disability studies, African American studies, museum studies, critical race studies. Yes, she knows what critical race theory really is. So if you want to know what it is, talk to her. Critical race studies, women's and gender studies, and so much more. She is a very accomplished writer and academician, and she is helping as we create this vision for this new Lewis Museum. She is helping us get to where we need to be. So Izetta will be in conversation with Naima. Now let me tell you about her. And Naima, I'm not reading your whole thing. It's just too much. Naima, she's a graduate of Yale University, Fordham University and Columbia University School of the Arts, where she earned her MFA. She has taught writing for over a decade in community settings, youth programs, and universities. She currently teaches in the low residency MFA program at Antioch University in Los Angeles. She is a 2022 mentor for the Periplus Collective. Naima is at work on her third novel, so let's stay posted, about early motherhood, class mobility, and the lifelong friendship between two women. She lives in Brooklyn with her family, and I am going to turn it over to Dr. Isaiah Mobley and to Naima Coster. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I hear this lovely.
I turned it off, so it's not me. I'll hold it this direction.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you on this rainy day?
I'm good. I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
Well, I am delighted to be in conversation with you. I'm going to give them a moment to figure out what's going on with the sound. It's a rainy day, or as I like to call them, these are good days to earn the rent or mortgage that you pay on a home and to read. It's like a super reading day. So, give us 1 second, folks. There's something meditative about that hum.
Put a beat over it.
I know, right?
Oh, I think it's mine, because I just turned it off and the sound went away. But now it seems like it's better.
Okay. All right. Well, here we go. My mom used to teach at a school called Madeira, and the tagline of the school is "Function in disaster, finish in style. Remain calm to your core." I repeat that to myself so many times.
Hello?
Yeah, there we go. Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Let's get comfortable. I'm so delighted to be in conversation with you. I don't know if you know that I read your book.
I had an idea.
I read it, I had tabs, I had questions, I had thoughts. And I know so many of you also have thoughts as well. But I wanted to actually start off by reading a short passage.
Oh, if you read it, that's even better.
If that's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. His daddy had told him not to move from the car, and he didn't mean to disobey, but his body started going all on its own. He was running up the lawn. His mother was slumped over like she'd been knocked down too, and she was screaming. There were doors opening down the street, but G couldn't turn to look. His eyes were set on his father, falling down, like he had been playing a game where one moment he was up and the next he was splayed out. G wedged himself between the grown-up bodies to kneel next to his daddy. He felt his mother lifting him away. He fought and kicked to stay close. She lost her grip on him, and he sank nearer to him, the one he loved. He used his hands to pinch his father's shoulders, his pretty iron shirt, his favorite. G shook him, called out to him, but he stayed still. He stuck his hand underneath his daddy's body to prop him up so he could hear. "Daddy," he said, "Daddy." When his hand came back to him, it was shiny with blood. It's very early in the pages of the novel, and it made me think so much about how trauma is present in the novel. So from those very first pages is anchored in how trauma can bloom in our lives. Yet each trauma in the book is distinct and unique to the character to whom it belongs. So how did you work as a writer to show the reader how trauma impacted each of the characters' lives?
That's a great question. And it's one that I continue to wrestle with, how to write about trauma in a way that is profound, but also sensitive. So in that particular passage, something that felt important was a point of view shift to G's point of view. The chapter hasn't been in his point of view. He's a young child, and I wanted to be close to him in those pages. That felt important to me, and is one of the motivations I have for writing, sort of getting really close to difficult experiences in order to render the emotional reality of them. And I think I'm interested in that because I grew up with a lot of stories of trauma from my family, but the emotional reality of them was always sort of missing. Like the trauma was something that happened and that was over. And sometimes it was told in a way that was funny, a funny family story or a heroic family story, some sort of legend. But what it was like to live through it and live with it was often something that I didn't know from the stories that I inherited. So I think when I'm writing, I'm always trying to get in the mind and the heart and the body of my characters. So I was certainly trying to do that with that scene. There's another part of your question that I want to make sure I don't neglect. Can you remind me?
How did you work to show the trauma in each of the characters' lives? Because the traumas for some characters are so different, and then for some of the characters, it's trauma after trauma after trauma, right? Particularly thinking of maybe of Lacey May and Noelle, Margarita, and then certainly Jade.
So part of it is certainly writing deeply into character, writing close to their experience emotionally and also bodily. And I think part of it is also writing beyond every character's individual awareness, which is one of the gifts of a novel with multiple points of view and this mosaic structure, is I can write about the ways that Lacey May is haunted, even if she might not describe herself that way. And the reader has room to see how moments throughout time speak to each other and echo, and maybe the ways that the characters themselves are missing. So closeness of point of view, but then also multiple points of view were something that helped me write within and beyond those character experiences.
And that scene with G is just right on the bone, it's so at the bone. And it's the closest to an internal life of G that we see, even though we see him older, but you see that first kernel of moment for him. And it's a very simple passage. It's not a passage that is overloaded with language. But to me, precisely because of how it was written, the rhythm, the scenes, the scene of G pitching at this pink and plaid shirt, that we learn that his dad wears specifically for this pink, for this picture, just had such, like it was right on the bone about trauma. And I remember reading it, it's on page 19, and I was like, oh.
It's a lot for a first chapter.
I was like, I should get ready, because I don't think that she's going to play with me about this. But that you had fallen in love. I fell in love with the relationship that he didn't have with his daddy from the early pages. This beautiful scene in the bakery when they're making the, getting ready to bake the food together, and that G is remembering what it smells like that you could smell it with him, and then you end on this heartbreaking scene. In some ways makes me feel for G, but then I have a question later about why he's so frustrated. I did want to talk about too, you mentioned that you began this book, I've heard, with Lacey May, our fierce loving mother who also happens to be a raving racist. I guess it happens to the best of us, I don't know. Right? But there's, why Lacey May? Why is Lacey May the landscape that anchors so much of the book? And she was, I understand, the first character who came to you.
Well, when I first imagined Lacey May, I didn't say, I want to write about somebody who opposes school integration. That wasn't the starting point for me. I wrote a short story called Cold, which was published in the literary journal Quayle, about a woman trying to keep the heat on for her girls while her husband is imprisoned. And so it was a story of survival, it was a story of sacrifice and compromise, and it was also a story about the lengths to which a mother will go to secure the future of her girls. And separately, I had this idea for a mosaic novel that would focus on different members of a community going through the integration of the local schools. And so as I was thinking about who might populate that book, I thought, what about Lacey May? What might she do in this novel? And so I thought about how something that seems like a virtue, going to any lengths for your children, can certainly become sinister and be used as a defense that seems unimpeachable for supporting all manner of ills and harmful, destructive policy. So she found her way in, and then I thought of the character of Jade separately as well, and thought, what if she were in this novel? And I think that I began with the mothers, but what I hope is that the heart of the novel really becomes their children as it progresses. Although they didn't come to me first, and they were initially just formed by the women who raised them.
And you said a little bit earlier, Lacey May is haunted. And in a Southern context, that always has multiple meanings. But for you, what are some of the ways that Lacey May is haunted?
Well, I think she's a woman who feels that she has hoarded potential, who feels that she could have gone further in life, and was consumed with the business of surviving, with the roles of wife and mother. She wants to ensure the fruition of her daughter's potential, and in her sort of obsession with her story of herself as a woman who could have been anything, she misses her own privilege and all of the ways that she's experienced numerous advantages, right? She says during a town hall meeting, I moved into this neighborhood fair and square, like why doesn't anyone else want to send their children to school in this district? And if the reader's been paying attention, the reader knows exactly how Lacey May ended up in the neighborhood and how that has to do with race and privilege and how her partner acquired his house from his white father, who's a World War II veteran. So I think she's haunted by that sense that she deserves more than she has.
And then I found it so interesting in the novel that Lacey May gains a certain sense of belonging with other white women who do not share her class status, who she might otherwise not have been invited into the fold with through her role and performance of a very particular kind of white motherhood, which I thought you did such a beautiful job of outlining. And it's so subtle, but that Lacey May's own class status is part of that haunting and longing. And then what she's able to access when she picks up this particular kind of anti-Blackness.
Yeah, I love hearing your thoughts.
But I think the thing that I found with the tension that I was trying to, because Lacey May was the character that I loved to hate, but then was also oddly compelled by.
Yeah.
Because that scene when she's going over to Ruth's house early to beg for money for oil, or can I break your leaves to do something to make money, right? Like you feel her desperation, and I feel so much for her.
Right.
And then you see her later in the novel, and you're like, Lacey.
Yeah. Well, Lacey May, she's terrible in many ways, right? And I mean, even in that early scene where she's a struggling mother who goes to Ruth, you don't really see Lacey May's racism there, but you see her sexism. And you see her anti-fat bias and all of the things, and her looking at Ruth and the way she thinks of the working woman next door. Lacey May, she's got a lot to untangle that few people in the book push her to disentangle.
So I found that so interesting, but I'm haunted also by I am haunted by, but she marries this Colombian man. And most readers most of us don't realize, but Colombia has a larger percentage of people of African descent than the US does. 40% of the population are people of African descent or Afro-Latino. So I thought that there's like, And then there's this portion in the book where she talks about the beauty of each of her girls, that she thinks Noelle will go the furthest, but Noelle, I think, is also identified
fairest.
as the fairest.
The lightest skin.
And then Diane is identified as the darkest skinned with the curliest hair. And then Margarita has her father's face, which she talks about as being very dismayed about later when she's trying to make her way in Hollywood. So there's this way that you worked in phenotypes, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that in relationship to Lacey May as the white mother.
Yeah, well, my family is not like the Ventura family in the book, but my extended Caribbean family is a family in which people identify differently and are also read differently in the world in terms of race. So that's something that I'm interested in, how siblings might have different understandings of themselves, different narratives of themselves, maybe at different points in their lives, and how sometimes that intersects with physical appearance, and sometimes it doesn't, right? Like Diane, who is brown and who gets looks from the neighbors, is the sister in this family who sort of forgives her mother's racism the most and just wants to get along and fit in. And so I was interested in that and these different narratives that can exist within a single family, a mixed family, what kinds of dynamics or tensions that might bring out with the mother. And then, I think one of the things that's fascinating about Lacey May is, the mental gymnastics that she will go through to sort of justify her twisted views and her racism. Like she says, like, well, they're all my daughters. Like, they're all my daughters. And Colombia is just a place that their father's from. And she doesn't see them as children of color.
Which is complex in particular for Noelle, who for me feels like the entire novel she's running away from whiteness. And then sort of like in the last few pages, she says to Gina Nelson, sorry, spoiler, says, I've been running away from whiteness all this time, and now people don't think that this is my child because she's red-haired. And that sort of, it's something in that clicked for me for the other parts of the book where it's very clear that Noelle is running away from her whiteness. So I wanted, which is almost the opposite, right? Lacey May's motherhood has her running toward whiteness, and Noelle's motherhood has her recognize, maybe for the first time, how she was really running away from it. So I wondered if you could talk about what motherhood does differently for sort of the mothers in the novel, Jade, Lacey May, and Noelle.
That's a great question. What motherhood does for each of them. Yeah. Well, in the book, we sort of have two reluctant but fierce mothers in the first generation of mothers, with Jade and with Lacey May. I've talked a little bit about Lacey May already. Jade is a very ambitious, talented young woman who has G when she's very young, and so has this ambivalence towards him because of all of the ways that she feels her opportunity in life are limited, but then she wants to step up for him in the ways that she knows how once she loses her partner and co-parent. And she knows that her son's already lost too much. So we have two mothers who kind of turn into warriors. They certainly see themselves that way for their children. But they don't always like being mothers, and they don't always seem to like their children. Which their children sense. And then Noelle's a very different kind of figure who longs for motherhood in adulthood, perhaps in the way that she longed for mothering when she was younger, and sort of sees motherhood, and for a while there, domesticity and marriage as a kind of redemption for her from her fractured, messed up family into one of her choosing. So, the meanings are certainly different across generation, but something that I was interested in with all of the characters is rendering the kinds of desires and dreams that they had sort of before that transformation of motherhood. And also, I think, wherever I could, trying to chip away at any kind of idealized or romanticized notion of a mother as one who knows best, or one you can always go back to, or whatever it may be, even for Noelle, with all of her sort of desires for redemption.
I love how you take motherhood seriously as a building your mom for women or people who parent and the role of mother, including Lynette, right, who is an other mother. We might think of Lynette as another mother, but I love how seriously you take motherhood and that that's a thread through all of the novels that you've written. Why?
Obsessed, yeah.
So let's talk about that obsession. Why the obsession and attention to motherhood, and what can we learn through that attention to motherhood?
Yeah, well, I talk about this frequently in therapy. I think that I have always, both before becoming a mother and now that I am a mother, have always been interested in sort of the easy wisdom that we have about motherhood and how it certainly seemed to break down when I tried to think about it in the context of my own life and my own troubled relationship with my mother. And I think I found that there was a sort of widespread cultural dishonesty about the many different ways that families can look and function and the ways we talk about family. Like family always is a safe place. Home is a place you can always go back to. I feel like I knew that wasn't simply true for all people, in part from my own life, but also from reading novels and reading memoirs. I knew more about the complexity of home, sometimes the pain of home, sometimes the power and transformation of claiming and creating one's own home. And so I wanted to write stories that kind of examined some of those easy adages and challenge them without then becoming wholesale condemnations of motherhood and family. Right, like being like, mommies are the worst, right? No. What I was interested in, but I was interested in that as a daughter and as a granddaughter, but I've also been interested in it as a mother myself, and sort of being like the inheritor of a lot of those limiting cliches and strictures. So I think I'm always writing against that and trying to uncover something messier, and certainly the relationships between parents and children are different in my two books. And in the third book that I'm writing, where the children are all under 1 year old. So really it's like the mother's relationship with themselves. Right. And with like their partners and with capitalism and all these other things.
That's, as I hear you speak, there are like three things all at once, so I'm gonna try to, there's one, I'm thinking of so much of the tradition of writers like Anne Petrie, Writing in the Street, and the way that motherhood is complicated, but that we see beyond this very simplistic idea of motherhood, because we see a mother struggling within her motherhood and her personhood. So that's just something that it makes me think of, and I think we share one of our favorite authors, Jesmyn Ward, who writes so beautifully in Salvage the Bones about maybe a motherhood we don't expect or that doesn't look like we should assume. But I was also struck by, and this is something I tried out in my 20s, which I do not recommend for other people, but somehow I thought I would call my mother by her first name. As if I don't know where I'm from. I'm not going to do it now either. Because I learned that lesson. But part of why I did that and went through this phase of doing that was because there was something happening for me in my 20s around recognizing that my mother was a woman before she was my mother. And so sometimes in my own head, I refer to my mom by her first name. as some kind of distinction and reminder for myself that my mother has had a whole life that was not wrapped up in me, which is sometimes something that you have to really pause and think about as a daughter.
Yes, and is maybe, I don't know her, but like is maybe the protagonist of, we continue to be the protagonist of our own stories, even as we take on roles, I think, of caregiving. So that's one of the things I think about, certainly, even just in thinking about like what characters are called, right? In my book, they're called, in my first book as well, the mothers are their first names.
And that's exactly what that Noelle often refers to, not her mom, but refers to Lacey May as Lacey May. And there's almost this interesting sort of competition of like, I'm going to be the opposite of what you are. But in a lot of ways, I feel like Noelle acts out some of the romantic dramas that she saw her mother engage in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, with both Noelle and with G, I think that there are ways that they really try to define themselves against their parents and their mothers in particular, but they carry their legacies with them. Sort of to go back to your first question about trauma, I think one of my motivations in writing about trauma is both to show the reality and the weight of it and the persistence of it. So not writing necessarily like an easy triumph narrative, but also the ways that people invent to live on. And I think both G and Noelle are people who perhaps repeat things, but they also, in meaningful ways, move beyond the legacies of their parents, I think.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that as a writer, what you wanted people to understand of where they had moved beyond?
Yeah. Well, I think in the character of G, something that I was trying to balance constantly was what are the pressures that he's under, and then also like what agency does he have, and what ways does he find of forging connection and making himself. So when he becomes one of the new Black students in the newly integrated high school and finds himself in this difficult position of scrutiny, we were talking before about Mr. Riley, who's a well-intentioned Black teacher that tells G he has to be a torch and light the way for others and be exemplary, which is just crushing advice for G, who's an anxious kid who just wants to fly under the radar and be a kid. Like to write about the pressure that he's under, both from this position in the school and then also his family history, which he's learned is something that he's not supposed to talk about, that he might be judged for, that is shameful. But then also saying like, well, besides all the things that he's carrying, what can G do? Like, what power does G have? And in the novel, the outlet that he finds, the expression that he has is in the production of the school play. And it's sort of neither here nor there how good of an actor G is, or what the production is like, but that opportunity for connection with other young people, the chance to begin to risk sharing more of himself. It ends up being a small act of self-making, right? It just acts in a play, a school play, but it changes the trajectory of his life and his understanding of himself.
And I find it so interesting, it's measure for measure, which is this really complicated Shakespearean play that sometimes people think about as a comedy.
Right.
But it's actually also like a political tragedy.
Yeah.
It involves lots of disguise. And some of the similar themes that are throughout, and also about ideas about justice and mercy. So interesting that that's the play that G is in. And that it's photography that later becomes his outlet, because that takes you all the way to the front of the book, the beginning of the book, where they're racing to get to this photograph and have this moment frozen in time, which is part of what G, as Nelson talks about, what he likes about photography, and then it turns out he's a natural. I thought was so interesting. When you talked about inheritance, I was curious about all of the different inheritances that are part of this novel. Grief as an inheritance, addiction as an inheritance. I feel like we should talk about Margarita, because Margarita, like, she needs somebody to pay attention to her.
Well, let's talk about it. Yeah.
Race and race memory as inheritance, whiteness as inheritance, and certainly probably most powerfully property as inheritance. So I wondered if you could talk about some of the inheritances, and maybe we could talk about poor Margarita who's tired of being left out.
Yeah, well, as you know, the book begins with the two fathers of these two families, and they don't figure into the rest of the novel as prominently as their children and their children's mothers, but the book begins with them and sort of dreams of real estate, like having a house, having something to pass down to one's children, property, belonging, sort of all the things that homeownership signifies. There's the dream of that. And, you know, for one family, it's realized for a time before it gets wrenched away. And then for the other family, never really comes into being, that dream of homeownership. But it's something I'm interested in, you know, like having a home. I don't own a home, and sometimes I interrogate why I want to. And I was saying to someone, I don't know what it is, besides like the American dream of a house. And then this friend was like, well, maybe that's it. Like, maybe that's like, oh, maybe that's the whole thing. You don't actually want to do lawn maintenance or like whatever it might be. So, you know, I think it represents a dream of stability, a dream of wealth, a dream of belonging, a kind of dream of provision and power that feels simple, like as complicated as it is, feels simpler, I think, than contending with some of the realities of how difficult it is to have and sustain a home.
And make a home, just the way that we think about homemaking is so powerful in this novel. But there's this undulating piece here about they're having all of this happen in a city that's undergoing a change into the New South, or sort of gentrification that quietly runs under. And I think maybe we see it most clearly in sort of this conversation of the integration of the school, but also with Mr. Riley, the English teacher, and his wife, Andrea. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why place was so important, but how you use place to get to these universal themes.
Yeah. Well, I think of myself as a very place-based writer, like thinking about how place forms us, forms our sense of ourselves, our imagination. I'm interested in the question of like what parts of us stay with us no matter where we go, and then what shifts, like what shifts for us when we're in different places. You know, like both Noelle and G get around this country and also get out of the country, and sort of their relationships to their identities are different in different places, whether it's the suburbs or Paris. So I'm interested in place and identity, and you know, my first novel was set in Brooklyn, which is where I'm from, and so I feel like it was the first book I was always going to write because it was about home. And then my second novel, this one was Mine and Yours, I started it after I left Durham, North Carolina, where I lived for 3 years. So the city and the larger region of the Piedmont were in my mind, like at the level of just like the land, like what does it look like, what was it like to be in this city and in this place, and then also just all of the observations and narratives that I was exposed to during my time there. You know, like a popular thing I heard said when I lived there was that Durham is a city with no racial majority, which is true. But one of the things I was interested in as a newcomer was like, well, what's underneath that sort of story? What kinds of connections and tensions and inequalities exist underneath that?
And historically, it could have had a racial majority, which could have been Black people.
Right.
But Durham, like Wilmington, North Carolina, are two places in which particular forms of Black wealth were often resisted by, and violently so, by white folks in those communities. So not having the majority isn't necessarily, there's something there about a narrative of like, racial utopia that you're unpacking for people. But then I was so interested in, I think there's this idea that hyper-local means that you can't get to universal themes. And it felt such the opposite for me, that by being hyper-local and by being so grounded in the land, because there are these pieces where Noelle is like walking to go to see her boyfriend, and she's talking about the smell of the land, or that is so grounded, but yet it feels so universal.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that has a lot to do, for me, I think about like, yeah, the body again, like in the body experiences. Like so often in my training as a writer, I learned about character as the mind. Like what is a character? A character is their thoughts, a character is their memories, their impressions. As opposed to a character is also like the body, and what the body remembers, feels, perceives. So always trying to write about that.
And it comes through, it definitely, it resonated for me as a reader, which is, I think above all, my primary identity is as a reader. That really resonated with me. So you mentioned in part, because I don't want to lose this, that you were in part inspired by Nicole Hannah Jones's work in This American Life, talking about Missouri. And I wondered about sort of the echoes that we're hearing right now in education about what can be taught, what can't be taught, and how we think about integration. And I know that you and I have a similar experience at predominantly white institutions. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how Nicole Hannah Jones's work and that sort of conversation about integration and education is infused into the book and might reflect some of your own experience or some of the questions that you think we should consider.
Yeah, well, it's funny how like the many seeds for this book came to me around the same time. So I moved to Durham in 2015, right? Yeah, 2015. And that was also when I heard Nicole Hannah Jones's reporting for This American Life in an episode called The Problem We All Live With. It's 2 parts, where she reports on sort of the accidental integration of the Normandy School District, which is the district in Missouri that Michael Brown graduated from. And so, you know, my husband shared this episode with me. I listened to it. I imagine some of you may have heard it. If you haven't, I encourage you to listen to it. I was re-listening to it recently, actually, and it brought me to tears again to listen to it, because part of what Nicole Hannah Jones includes in this episode is audio footage from a community meeting from white parents opposing the introduction of their neighbors of Black children into the school. And it's chilling to hear the arguments that are made, including that it is cruel to label racism as racism and allege that anyone is being racist. I found myself thinking, much like Hannah Jones in her reporting, about what it's like to be a child of color in that room, hearing that reaction to your presence. And so I wanted to write about that. And, you know, my experience in school is quite different than, say, my character G's. You know, I went to a private all-girls school in Manhattan, so different.
I never asked you what school.
It's the Spence School.
I know Spence.
What was that?
I said, I know Spence, but all my friends were at Chapin.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's okay.
Yeah,
so different, very, very different than the high school in the novel, but some similarities in the sense that, like, I went to a well-resourced school with excellent teachers because of the program, where I was one of the few students of color in the room. And so I knew sort of like the pressure of that, the alienation of that. We were talking about this a little bit, some of the troubling narratives that come along with that, from needing to prove one's belonging, which wasn't a pressure that existed for anybody else. And the sort of the insidious effects of internalizing that idea that you must prove your belonging or your worth, as opposed to it is inherent and cannot be taken away from you, and doesn't need to be bestowed by anybody. It's certainly one of the things that G wrestles with over the course of his life. I know I'm certainly unpacking the effects of an experience that did change the trajectory of my life, but also gave me a different kind of narrative of myself than I had when I went to my neighborhood public school where all the children were Black and brown.
I think a lot about is the sacrifice worth it? Because I think Mr. Riley's character in the novel is sort of saying like, yes, you're the bright torch, you're the future. And I think that you and I might be part of a generation of folks who are not traditionally integrating schools, but we were doing the work of integration. And people don't frequently talk about what had to be sacrificed in order for that to happen, but we're supposed to be grateful for it. I'll never forget, I went to go see Alex Koplowitz speak, and I said something to him about really appreciating the way that he was talking about race in the novel, and he asked me what school I went to, and I told him what school, and then he said, see, you never would have gotten into that school if you hadn't gone to this other school. And I remember feeling so crushed because my thought was that what I had to sacrifice for my own personal self, what you have to sacrifice in order to survive those kind of situations. So I guess I guess maybe that's something to unpack. Is the sacrifice worth it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Or maybe can I reframe it? Or,
Yeah, please. I'm reframing it in my mind, like, that's not the right question.
Or
What makes it?
Yeah, or, like I did an interview once with someone who said, like, G goes through such a hard time in the book. Maybe integration isn't the answer. And I was like, well, that's not the takeaway. Like,
Maybe racism isn't the answer.
that's not the takeaway. Like, and it shows a limited imagination, right? The better question is, how could this experience, right, have been made different? Like, what could have been put in place? What kind of culture, what kind of policies, what kind of supports could have been put in place to make it a different kind of experience, particularly by the people in power. Like, this book really looks at the children doing the best with what they got, but, there's, I think, a real absence of compassionate and just leadership in the book. Like if the principal just kind of throws her hands up in the community meeting, doesn't really intervene. Mr. Riley intends to be helpful, but just puts extra pressure on G. So yeah, I think that's the question I'm sort of interested in. Like, how could this be different? Like, what could we imagine? In these cross-racial settings.
I like that question better.
I have an answer.
I like that better because it's true that Mr. Riley is oddly aloof, even as he's telling G to be the torchbearer. He's oddly aloof in terms of what that actually means, or what could make this possible for G.
Yeah.
So I like that question better. What would have made this possible and easier for him? So G is the heartbeat for me in the novel. I love him and I love him very love him. But I found this irony that he resents his mother Jade because she doesn't mourn and she doesn't let him mourn the way that he needs to. But he resents Noelle for mourning. And I was really trying to peel back and sort of understand. It's a very complicated, which I don't know that he ever comes to fully understand.
I think people are endlessly fascinating because we so often, right, like sometimes we don't make any sense. I think that learning how to grieve is it's something that has to be learned, like anything else, right? I think about this my role as a parent. Like, my daughter doesn't know how to use a spoon, but she also doesn't know how to talk about or express or sit with her feelings necessarily. These are all things that are taught. So I think that G knows that he didn't get something essential that he needed as a boy, but that doesn't mean he knows how to do it for himself or for his loved ones in adulthood.
And it doesn't go to learn.
Doesn't what?
He doesn't seem to say, okay, I'm gonna go learn this. Until that moment where his sort of life and his root is asunder. So for me, I almost felt, wow, what happens to him? Does he learn it? And wanting him so much to learn it, because just at the, he is the heartbeat of the novel in the beginning and at the end.
Yes.
And my heart still ached for him. Even although I was furious, it still ached for him.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful you had that compassion for him. You know, at the end of the book, I wanted the end of the book to feel like a beginning for G, for him to be brought to the precipice of something, rather than the book would see some kind of transformation for him complete. Rather than that, it would bring him to a really essential juncture. And I believe that there's like greater healing waiting for him beyond the ending of the book. But it doesn't mean that he doesn't lose some things he didn't want to lose over the course of the novel.
And talk about sacrifice and growing up, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having this conversation. It's been a real delight and pleasure and honor. I could keep talking, but I see that my boss is standing up. And
Because we're gonna let some of these people talk.
I've learned how my boss stands up.
This is your opportunity to ask any questions. I'm going to turn this off. I think Terry has a mic that she can pass around. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, ma'am. She's gonna bring you the mic.
Hello. So what made you think about integration? What led you to include that and make that such an important part? Because, I mean, you're younger than most of that time period, so what led to that?
Yeah, well, the first seed of inspiration was that reporting by Nicole Hannah-Jones, which I first came to hear about in This American Life. And there she's talking about immigration in 2013, 2014. And then in, some of my reading over the course of working on What's Mine and Yours, I read about immigration efforts in Raleigh, Wake County schools in the early 2000s that used kind of economic immigration, which served as a proxy for racial immigration. So, that's where it came from in terms of why do I care to write a whole novel about this? I think it was an interest in the experience of being a young person in school, of being one of the few students of color in a largely white environment, in educational opportunity, class mobility, the kinds of rifts and pressures that can create across generations, just all of the themes around that are things I wanted to write about.
And if I'm not mistaken, schools now are more segregated than they were pre-war Brown versus Board of Education. So it's
Public schools.
Public schools, yes. So it's interesting to think about what we imagine that integration of the project is over.
Yeah, even thinking about region, right? Like New York City has some of the most segregated schools in the United States, New Jersey.
Another question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask a question, kind of on the same lines, which is, how do you envision integration working? Because I know that, I grew up in southern Prince George's County, but I graduated from high school the year before busing started. And it failed. I mean, it's just on a flip-flop, and their schools are still not integrated, and it sounds like other places are like that. But what could you picture? I mean, they tried, when I lived there with my kids later on, we put them in a magnet school. All that did was raise the average income in the school, so they didn't qualify for Chapter 1 anymore, or Title 1. You know, that it was crazy. I mean, it's like, what kind of idea might work?
Yeah, I wouldn't endeavor to be like the person to give that answer, but I'm happy to point towards people who I think are equipped to give a good answer. One of them is Nicole Hannah-Jones. This is much of her work. There's this American Life episode I mentioned, but there's both of them, and there's also her famous article for the New York Times, choosing a school for my daughter in a segregated city, about sending her daughter to New York City public schools. There's another great podcast in the New York Times called Nice White Parents, also about New York City immigration. And so I think, I'll point you to, her and to others, but I'll also say that I think that in discussing the failure of integration, it's important to discuss like what contributed to that. And one thing is like white families moving away, divesting, so that the integration wasn't lasting or effectual, right? So it's like white divestment, like flight, and doesn't.
And that we do our funding of schools through property taxes, which almost always indirectly means that there will be disproportionate resources.
Okay, so I will endeavor to give you my opinion.
Let's hear it.
Not that it is expert in any way, shape, or form, but my perspective is that we ought to focus less on integration and more on quality. I think that what we want is quality schools for all young people. And if people have moved out of the community and the community all looks like me, so what? But those schools should be just as good as the schools in communities where everybody looks like you. And we know what the lessons are. We know how to teach kids. We know how to teach kids. We know how to provide wraparound services. We know what young people need. The question is whether or not we value all young people the same. It would be nice for us to have integrated communities, but the fact of the matter is that we don't. The fact of the matter is that when Black kids start moving into certain schools, white parents move their kids out. And I frankly don't want to bear the burden of trying to figure out how to get them to move back in. But what I want is for all children to have a quality education so that we can stop competing between Baltimore City and Howard County and start thinking about competing between Maryland and China, because that's what we need to do. Question? Sir?
Naima,
Yes.
I was born in North Carolina, a place called Hamlet, birthplace of John Coltrane. He had a daughter named Naima.
I thought it was one of his wives. I thought he was married to Naima and Alice. No?
His wife's name is Alice Coltrane.
Uh-huh.
One of his daughters named Naima. And that's why I said I appreciate you giving all due respect to that name.
Yes, I was named after a song, Naima. Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to ask about the point you made in regards to the character G and thinking about their experience in school and kind of digging into the idea of what could have the adults around him done to make a way for him instead of burdening him with the idea of being a torchbearer.
Mm-hmm. Like what could have been done for this? Yeah. Well, I think that as a former young person, and as somebody who has worked with young people, I think that one of the most powerful things that could have been said to me and that I see a longing for is just the idea that like there is nothing wrong with you. Like I think that that's something that many young people yearn to hear. I think I certainly long to hear that. And I think that the underside of much of what G is told. He's never directly told there's something wrong with you, but that seems to be the subtext of much that he's told. When he gets the sense that talking about his family history is shameful, that he needs to go above and beyond his origins, be different than his mother, go further. I think that the underlying message is that there's something wrong and that there's something missing. And also with what Mr. Riley says too, right? Like, be a torch, prove them wrong, as opposed to, you are wonderful just as you are, G. And, right, like, you're entitled, you deserve, people treat you poorly. It's not because you have failed to be a torch. It's because of who they are and who they choose to be. So I think that as much as that messaging and stance could have been adopted by the adults, from parents to teachers to school leadership, would have been useful. But I bet you have thoughts about this too, or maybe different.
I do think that we are part of the generation of folks who integrated, but it was not formally recognized as integration. And that there are costs to that. But I think I'm right with you, that G should have been told that he was entitled to be entirely who he was, as opposed to a symbol. Because I do think that's what's happening for young people who do end up doing that. And a generation that is not Elizabeth Eckford, or it doesn't look like our traditional ideas of integration, but there's actually not support for those young people. And that doesn't protect them from internalized white supremacy. And that becomes very critical and important, so that you're not just sending your Black and brown children off to be told constantly that they have to be torch bearers and representative of their race, and they have to do things in a particular and certain way. And then they don't get to be who they might truly be, or who they are, right? And so I think that that really is a cost that we have to be careful about. I actually went through this where I was like, I'm not sure integration is the answer as we imagine it. Because integration as we imagine it is based on the idea that Black children are better by being with white children. And it's really the resourcing, right? And that white children should benefit from the amorphous diversity of colored children. So it's constantly putting children of color in a position of, I don't know what to call it, but some form of depersonhood, right? That doesn't allow them to simply exist as children who grow and are entitled, right? But somehow have to apologize or conform. And so I think there's something there, and particularly about a Gen X and millennial generation who had that experience, for which we as a culture don't have the language to unpack and talk about. Because we don't think about integration stories that way, and also we don't think about them. But to me, also G is very gendered, right? It's very gendered what G is able to do in a way that I don't think that Black women are able to, even if they have an experience of being epitome wise, we do not get the same separation. There's a way that we are culture bearers, are expected to be culture bearers in a way that men are not. And we talked a little bit about patriarchy and those things, but I think there's something so rich, and that's why I find the novel so interesting, because it really is doing 21st century race dynamics, right? Like complicated, rich, race, class, and gender all together.
Thanks, I gave him a shot.
I have a question. You mentioned several times, like in this day and age of integrating in the school, been one of the few Black you talk about some of the costs. I hear some of the costs in some of your answers, but for a person that's not really consciously aware of or know how to navigate what that costs them, how do you see that showing up? For the few Blacks, sometimes they are the only one, or they're pushed to work 3 times as hard, and they don't see what they're sacrificing. How do you see, or exactly what you see that cost to be for the individual?
I mean, I think to start with sort of like the most grim, you know, I think a lot about stress and like shortened life expectancy, carrying of stress in the body, like the ongoing sort of pressure to prove one's belonging takes a physical toll, a psychological and physical toll. There's a term. What's the
Is it
term?
like the imposter syndrome?
Is it John Henry?
Which,
But, yeah, like the imposter syndrome, but also just like the literal like stress of being confronted with racism, with microaggressions, the pressure to prove oneself, to excel. Just people like being worked to the bone and stressed and having real consequences on the body and physical well-being is something that I think about for people in my life. Who I know have had trajectories like this, where the work is unending. And sort of like the task of proving oneself, it can never be completed. Like, what does that even mean? And you know, excellence and exceptionalism doesn't save anybody from racism and from harm. So I think about that. Think about self-esteem, formation of self-esteem in a young person, and a sense of who one is, whether that needs to be changed. Yeah, sometimes I like to say I went to the school spent that was mentioned, and sometimes I think I carry with me the sense that like I'm always in the classroom at Spence, except for sometimes when I'm not, and it's great. And you know, a different version of me, a different self, can surface and be rediscovered, as opposed to when I have that feeling of being in that classroom. But
yeah, I think for me, it's a yearning. It was always a yearning to come back to my people. But then being told that you had to be separated from your people to do this great race thing, right? Like, you have to do this to be a torch. But like, all I really wanted to do is go back to be with my community. And being told that you're supposed to be doing this for your community and you're supposed to just take it. And I mean, I had like racial stuff that was just ridiculous. And that you're just told you're supposed to take it. And then find ways to navigate that at a very young age. So like, I think some of the things that I do is like, you're just not gonna catch me slipping. Because let me tell you, when you've been the only one at a predominantly white institution, and people are hazing you, and like, white folks really know how to haze. Like, good luck trying to get a rise out of me. And I think that that's one of the things that I think is most distinct to me, for me, about my experiences. I often look very calm to people, but part of it is because, like, you have people, literally, I had a classmate's friend take me to Denny's when Black people were boycotting Denny's because he thought it would be funny. So it's me at 9 at Denny's with this lawyer and doctor who thought it would be funny to take me to Denny's because Black people were boycotting. Or like people enacting real microaggressive violence, psychological violence. And you have to learn at a young age how to resist that. And that is, to me, like, I don't think that all young children should have to learn how to do that. I mean, I had to tell, like, I used to write memos in triplicate. So by the time I was 10, I would write a memo in triplicate. Here's one for the principal, here's one for my teacher, and here's a copy of it for myself about how I got called the N-word. I just want it all documented, thank you. Right? I still write memos in triplicate.
So here's one of the things I say to people so they can kind of understand this dynamic, and certainly with young people in those situations, it is difficult because they don't have the wherewithal, if you will, to figure out how to maneuver some of that. But being Black in America is a 24-hour-a-day job. And then you gotta go to work. And that's the way I look at it. I mean, it's life for Black folks, you always know that you're Black, right? It's never a not thinking of it. And then you have to go to work. And so layer that on top of a child who is in a situation where they really don't have the ability to be able to deal with something. And that's what we have.
Or you learn, because I feel like I learned.
Of course, but you didn't know when you first got there.
No, but you're so young by the time that you learn, it's already so fully ingrained in you. Because I remember when I was a little kid, it got to the point where I would see these people, would you rather deal with me or my mother? Right? Like, so it taught like a really, I became an adult in a lot of ways much earlier.
Which is also an issue with Black and brown children, that they are not allowed to have a childhood. But that's a whole nother story, right?
Back to G.
Can I just mention that the garage will close at 6:30, so it's open until 6:30. Other questions? Okay.
Lighter note. First of all, I look forward every year to the One Maryland, One Book. So, and these are some of my readers, my sister friend readers that we share a lot of recommendations and, you know, with each other. And I can't keep up with them, but I do the best I can. So anyway, so it's just it's a wonderful process in the spring that, you know the 3 books are going to be identified that are in the top running, and then your book was selected. So how does that make you feel? And is that like a Miss America moment, or, I mean, because I'm sure that you're around and about and talking about your novel, but I'm not sure, I mean, is this the only one that goes through that type of process, or, so how does that make you feel to know that your book has been selected, this whole state is being encouraged to read it, and then, you got people like me and my friends who are like, we're waiting to find this out, and then we look forward to what event can we go to in order to meet that author, so.
Yeah, well, it's amazing, and it's a tremendous honor. As a writer, I don't count on any particular honors or awards. The thing that you hope for is to get to keep writing, and so it was an amazing honor, and I'm so excited to go around the state of Maryland. And the other 2 finalists, Elizabeth Acevedo and Nadia Rusu, are writers I greatly admire. So I was honored to be in their company, and there were other writers I did admire on the long list, Angie Cruz. So I was in the company of many of my heroes, many writers I admire. So I wasn't counting on it. I wasn't betting on myself there. But I think that one of the gifts to me of this experience is going to be interacting with readers and seeing how the book has come to life for them. Because it was with me for so very long. And then I did a virtual touring experience. My book came out a year and a half ago. But I think something different happens in person when there can be spontaneous connections. So one of the treats already just of today has been hearing about people's experiences with the themes of the book. Like this is the stuff of life. And so hearing about people's stories, but also things they loved about the book, things they did not love about the book, they had issues with. I already heard some words about the ending. But that's a gift to me too, to sort of see the work come alive. And so it's a tremendous honor. I feel very lucky. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
All right, well, join me in thanking Naima Coster and Dr. for moderating this discussion. Naima is going to be signing books out in the hallway, and I would be remiss if I didn't say, if you aren't a member of the Lewis Museum, consider becoming one. Also, there were programs that were running through here that we have coming up. We've got something for everyone. We've got film screenings that are coming up on Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. We're going to be screening a film called By Any Means Necessary, which is about squeegee workers to help people understand who these young people are. And we also have Dr. Lawrence Jackson Brown, Dr. Lawrence Brown, who is going to be talking about the Black Butterfly coming up. So they're great programs. Go to our website. You can register on the website. All are welcome here. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being with us this afternoon. Thank you, Naima. It's been a pleasure. And please get your books out.